What has been your most bone-chilling, hair-raising, let's get the hell out of here experience? I'm a criminal defense investigator. I had a murder case involving two brothers. The one accused of the murders was very autistic, and his brother was a schizophrenic. The schizophrenic brother lived in a potato shack in the middle of the desert. I needed to talk to him several times throughout the course of the investigation, and since he didn't have a phone or electricity, I had to drive several hours out to his house and yell his name from the fence line until he came out of the shack. This investigation lasted for several years, and over time I developed a rapport with schizophrenic brother, and I kind of got to like him. He would talk your ear off about the aliens with golden eyes in the underground tunnels that connect all the Walmarts in the country, but he was pretty entertaining, and part of me wonders how much of it was a show. Schizophrenic brother eventually gets a girlfriend. She's a tweaker who has mistaken his schizophrenia for meth-induced psychosis. I talked to her a few times in jail when she was sober, and she was surprisingly charming and insightful. The last time I go to see schizophrenic brother, it's a dark winter night, and tweaker girlfriend is there. She's lurking in the shadows and staring daggers at me the entire time I'm talking to him. I cut off his conversation about the speakers in his fillings and walk back to my truck to leave. A minute later, schizophrenic brother comes running out and tells me that he wants to show me something in his shack. He's never invited me inside before, and I'm not thrilled by the prospect. The whole thing feels off to me, so I tell him I have to get going and start the truck. The look of relief on his face when I declined to go inside convinced me that tweaker girlfriend was waiting behind the door with a hammer or something. A few months later I learned that she shot him in his sleep and stashed his body in an old refrigerator. She has since pleaded guilty to his murder. Possibly fighting a house fire and realizing that I had very hot feet. Through concrete-soled boots, my officer and I immediately nope the F out. Hot feet mean you're standing above a fire. As fire burns upwards, it's weakening the floor beneath you. So we were about to plummet into a basement fire. One time I was out in Colorado with some buddies, hiking near the top of a mountain. Some bad weather started to roll in, but the top was only 15 minutes away, so I went ahead while they went back down. As I was getting to the top I felt static in the air and the hair in my head started to stand up. I immediately started to panic cause I thought I was about to get struck by lightning, so naturally I ran down without ever getting to the top. I'm not sure if I was gonna get struck, but I sure as hell wasn't sticking around to find out. Exploring an abandoned high-rise. Out of the blue my friend grabbed me by my collar from behind. I was about to step into an elevator shaft. After swearing at him, "What the F?" he said, "Look," and I saw the drop of like 20 floors to a concrete bottom with broken metal rods sticking out. We went home. He saved my life 100%. I had a friend die this way. Elevator shaft at an abandoned rubber factory. Urban exploring. It was pitch dark except for the city light coming through the windows at the end of the hall. Lived for 21 days in ICU and died from sepsis during surgery number 4. Unconscious the whole time. I worked a lot in remote areas of West Texas, servicing oil field related equipment. One time I was out in the middle of nowhere as usual, and to the northeast was a butte. An isolated hill that's bigger than a regular hill but smaller than a mountain. But everywhere else around was pretty flat. There was one road in and out of the site I was at. At some point when I was working on a control box, I had the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the horizon, looked all around the butte, and went back to work. This happened a few more times within several minutes until I finally saw something move on the side of one of the rock outcroppings on the butte. I went to my truck, grabbed my binoculars, and the figure hid behind that outcropping. It was definitely a human. I glassed him for a good 20 minutes and I could see him peek around every couple of minutes. Eventually he leaned out so far that I could see the silhouette of the barrel of a rifle slung around his back. At some point he was hidden behind his rock for a while, and the next time he peeked out, I couldn't see the rifle. He had either put it down somewhere or he was now holding it. I immediately felt a sense of impending doom. The hair on my arms and neck was standing straight up. I very quickly collected my tools, got my AR-15 from behind the driver's seat and sat it on the passenger seat. and tore out of there. I sped down the dirt road, almost clipped the cattle guard, and started cruising down the highway just as the adrenaline started to wear off. I remember the metal taste in my mouth and having to grip the steering wheel to keep my fingers from twitching. A few miles down the road, a maroon Suburban full of guys was pulled over on the oncoming side of the road. They definitely weren't oilfield workers. Shades all around, buzzed heads, all intently looking at me. I expected them to pull a U-turn and pursue me, but they didn't. I can't prove that this is what was happening, but I do know that cartel guys run operations where one scouts for guys working alone and calls in a group of guys to rob them of their truck and tools. I must have been around 10 or 12 when this happened. I was walking back home one afternoon, around 3 or 4 p.m. after strolling around the neighborhood, which was usually very safe, friendly and quiet. I was on the opposite side of the block, the houses behind ours, which wasn't an issue, because there happened to be a park that went across the whole block and connected to the other side, so you didn't have to go around the whole block. So I was only a few houses away. I went through the park, a park I had played at my entire childhood, without paying much attention. When about halfway through, this guy who I didn't know, definitely older than me, wearing a hoodie started calling me, "Dude, come over here one sec. What do you want? Come here. I just wanna ask you something." "Okay, ask me from over there." No, come over, please. No, tell me from over there." At that point, another dude that was sitting next to him gets upset. I hear a, "That's it," and they both stood up quickly and started making their way towards me. I can't recall how far they chased after me, but my instincts just told me to run like hell and I did. To this day I still don't know if they were gonna mug me, if they were just taking the piss or what was happening, but it definitely scared kid me. In very early 2020, I was in Lumbini, Nepal. It's a small town built around this complex of ruins that was once the palatial home of Siddhartha Gautama. The Bodhi tree is located there. I was staying in a cheap hotel along a muddy road leading out of the city and was the only guest in the building. Many stray dogs roamed the streets of that quarter at night, and you'd often hear them barking or getting into fights. This one night was particularly bad. A low fog had settled on the road and the dogs were out in force, howling and barking. Out of nowhere came this bellowing roar, one so loud and sonorous, I felt it in my chest. Then, a vacuum of complete silence. All I could think of were ways to keep whatever had made that sound outside. The next day, I heard that a tiger had wandered over from the nearby reserve, along the lake, and eaten a few of those stray dogs. I don't tell this story often, but this seems like a good place. Back in college I used to drive up the Oregon coast on weekends, then just crash in my car when I got tired. I woke from a nap in the driver's seat, and something just didn't feel quite right. It was just dusk and the light was fading pretty fast. I yawned and stretched, and as I did so I turned my head to the side and just caught a face ducking down below my rear passenger window. I went to hit the lock button just to make sure, and in my panic, I accidentally unlocked the doors briefly and then locked them again. I stared at the window for a few minutes, knowing that someone was crouching just out of sight. Eventually, I started the car and thought I heard a scuffing sound. Whoever it was didn't reappear, but that was enough for me. As I noped out of there and pulled out back onto Highway 101, I glanced back and a bald figure in a red t-shirt, with something wrapped around his face, booked it into the woods on the side of the road. That was the end of that weekend trip. I drove the 2 hours back to my dorm room, white-knuckled hands locked on the steering wheel. I had to pull over a few miles down the road though, to deal with the adrenaline shakes. My wife and I were on a search mission for some missing fern pickers. We were volunteers with the local search and rescue (SAR) team. We decided to stay in the search area that night and had built a pretty nice fire. We were sitting there and it was about 2 a.m, hoping this dude would wander into camp. I had heard animals around us throughout the night. No surprise, we are in the middle of the woods. I'm used to animals stalking around outside my camp. I knew there were 2 animals, one each side of us. It was at about that point when we heard a bird chirp. It came from about the place I figured one of the animals were, then another, from the opposite side. I immediately realized we were being watched and stalked by at least 2 cougars. We very quickly climbed into the back of my truck, It's got a camper shell and is outfitted for truck camping. Back when my son was only about a year old, my husband worked second shift, so I was alone every evening. We lived in townhouses at the time and had a neighbor who was a war vet my husband was friendly with. He was a little off in the sense there was very obvious PTSD and other traumas, but all around a nice dude. Anyway, one evening this guy knocked on the door. I opened it thinking he probably was looking for my husband and I was just gonna let him know he was working. Dude was super drunk, wouldn't stop talking and kinda made his way into the house. He also brought his huge ass German Shepherd with him. I was trying to be friendly but I had the worst feeling in my stomach. I felt insanely vulnerable and like something just wasn't right with this situation. I kept trying to tell him in the nicest way to leave but he wouldn't. I texted my husband, "Hey neighbor, guy's here and won't leave. He's trashed. I feel really uncomfortable." My husband texted his buddies that lived a few apartments down, and they came over immediately. They got the dude out of the house, and not even 20 minutes later I hear noises outside and this guy is trying to rip the license plate off my car. My husband's friends heard it or saw it, I'm not really sure, but they came over and were more aggressive about him going home and leaving me alone. And he did. So I thought. Few hours later my husband gets home and sees this guy hanging out crouched behind some cars. He goes up to him to ask him exactly what the F he's doing. I don't know the exact details, because I stayed hiding in the house, but this guy had ropes and some other weapon on him and full intentions of raping me that night. It makes me sick to think that, if my husband's friends wouldn't have came over as fast as they did to help me, my poor son would have watched something horrible happen to me. Or even what he would have even done to my child. Hiking in the Rocky Mountains, on a trail I knew pretty well. I was leading a group of kids, maybe 20 or so middle school age children. From the camp where I worked, I turned a corner and saw jawbone of a deer. Pretty cool, showed it to the kids. Didn't have any flesh on it, so I assumed it was pretty old. 100 feet further down the trail I find another bone. Femur maybe. I specialized in insect populations, not deer anatomy. This one looked a little fresher. Another ways down, another bone. I'm getting a little nervous at this point, so I explain that we should probably turn around and head back. My students all groan that they want to see more dead stuff, but I shepherd them down the train and back to camp. 2 days later we got a call at the camp that someone had been attacked in the area by a mountain lion. Apparently a mountain lion had set itself up in the caves on the cliffside and it had gotten pissed when someone got too close. I'm glad we left the area, even if my students would have loved to see more dead stuff. Driving Uber one night a couple years back, I picked up 4 guys from a club. Listening to them talk I realized that 2 guys, one of them ordered the ride, had met the other 2 at the club and were on the way to get coke from one of their cousins. There was an odd vibe. Some of the conversation didn't seem the most linear, and I was hyper aware that these drunk dumbasses were heading with 2 strangers to a drug deal, and I was the one driving them. I did not want drugs in my car, and I was very aware that we might be on the way to an ambush. If we'd been heading anywhere remote or sketchy I had to figure out how to end the ride. The 2 wannabe dealers kept trying to get in touch with their cousin via cell phone. Went to an apartment just off a main street, and after both had gone into the building I just said, should we leave to the guys, and we did. I still don't know if it was just a ploy for a free ride, guys too drunk or dumb to pull off a basic coke deal, or something nefarious that didn't finish. The 27th of July, 2002 Skniliv Air Show disaster. I turned 5 years old the day before. It's one of my most vivid memories from childhood. How the pilot landed 10 meters away from me and my dad. He was on his knees, his parachute dangling in the wind, and I remember him repeating, "What have I done?" over and over. I didn't understand much of what happened. My dad only said, "Close your eyes, we have to go." My dad told me years after that we would have gone farther into the crowd, but I refused to go because my shoelace was untied. Him kneeling to tie my shoes is the only thing that saved us. It wasn't bone chilling at the time, but when I imagine what my dad witnessed that day, I get goosebumps. When I was 27 my girlfriend lived in a crappy part of Hollywood, FL near US 1. She had a kid pretty young, but the dad ended up going to jail for assault. The place she could afford was run down AF, with all sorts of addicts and genuine lowlifes living in the units around her. She hated the place. She couldn't move in with me because I was just renting a room where I lived. It was better than living at her parents' though. Drunk abusive dad, addict's mom. I went to visit her after my shift ended at 9 PM. Picked up some food and planned to cook for her. We were there for about an hour, just sitting on the couch watching her kid play with a box. Then the banging started on the door. She looks terrified thinking it's her ex. I'm kind of freaked out also, because I heard all these stories about him. Some guy is cursing, hitting something against the door hard. We don't even want to peek through the window or peephole thinking he's got a gun. We call the police but the operator is having a tough time hearing. Then we hear some other woman screaming and cursing. He had the wrong door. We hear them start fighting. Smashing. More screaming. Sounds like she's spitting and we hear punches. We're not sure if it's her or him, but it's loud. 911 operator says police are on their way. The kid starts screaming because he's scared. The man outside starts banging on the door again. He thinks his kid is with us and shouts he's going to kill us for taking his kid. My GF just breaks down at this point and starts crying. Maybe 10 minutes later the police arrive. They arrest both of them then took our statements. She moved out a couple days later and we ended up renting another crappy apartment but in a much better area. Once when I was like 8 years old I lived in a trailer park with mostly normal but occasionally sketchy folks around. I was really bored at home and asked my parents if I could walk up the street to my friend's house. Not very far, maybe just out of sight of my parents' trailer. It was like the middle of the day and we knew a lot of people on our street. So my parents said yes. So here I am, an 8-year-old little girl walking to my friend's house. Just as I got out of sight, I saw an adult man walking towards me straight ahead. I immediately have my alerts on, cause I was alone of course and had never seen this dude before. I keep hoping he veers off on another course away from me, but he keeps coming towards me and I notice his eyes are locked on me and he's smiling. I got the creeps but I was pretty close to my friend's house now. I looked around and realized there wasn't anyone else outside to witness anything. He finally gets close enough to say something to me and this is what made me run. He said, "Hey, do you think you could take your shoes off? Please. I want to see your feet." And I said, "Huh, what?" And he asked me again to see my feet. Y'all, I turned around and sprinted so fast back to my house. I was terrified. Used to work on an ambulance and the company that I worked for had more ambulances than there were firehouses, medic stations. To keep up with increasing call volumes, so we would do something called posting, which is where you park the ambulance somewhere within the area that you are servicing while you wait for a call. Was working the midnight to 10 AM shift one night, and it was really slow. On slow nights, we would try to find the darkest areas we could find to post in an attempt to catch some sleep. We find a church within a neighborhood whose parking lot had virtually no light, so we decide to park there. As soon as my partner put the rig in park, I instantly felt incredibly uncomfortable and unsafe. I didn't want to say anything to my partner as I literally had no reason to feel the way I was, but the feeling was almost overwhelming. A few minutes go by and my partner looks at me and says, "Hey man, I don't feel right. Something just feels off. Do you want to get out of here?" I replied, "Yes," and we got the hell out of there. I have never really figured out why we both had that sensation and why it came on in that church's parking lot, but it sure did give me the creeps. A friend and I were exploring an abandoned factory in North Philadelphia about 8 years ago, and when we got to about the 3rd floor, I discovered a booby trap in the stairwell. Basically it was a tripwire that swung an axe down from the ceiling. Right as that fully set in, we heard someone from up above shout, "Yo, time to go." I've never covered that much ground so fast. I think we were 2 or 3 blocks away before we realized we were riding each other's bikes. A little bit different than the rest of the stories, but it gave me chills. My mom's best friend owns a farm about a half hour from where I grew up. We went there nearly every weekend to help with upkeep and caring for our horses. All day you could just feel a storm brewing. The wind, humidity, outside had a greenish tint, and the clouds rolling in as the sun was setting. Right after supper it started raining. Hard. A lot of wind and lighting too. I was looking out the window across the yard and thought I saw something above the barn on the far side of the yard. I was petrified. It looked like rotation in the clouds and it started lowering down. I pointed it out to my dad. He said it was rain bouncing off the roof of the barn. We both looked out for a moment and clearly saw it suck back up into the clouds. I got goosebumps. We looked at each other for a second in disbelief. Then he shrugged and went back into the living room. I sheltered in the bathroom. The next day, we saw in the news that an F4 tornado ripped through a small town, Spencer, SD, about 24 miles from where we were. I got chills when I saw the news reports. We were tearing down an old outbuilding office on my in-laws' farm. We wanted to save as much of the lumber as we could to reuse in a chicken coop. So, we pulled a large piece of plywood off one of the walls, and the insulation was crawling with hundreds of snakes. Said snakes immediately started exiting the wall towards us in a writhing horde. There are rattlesnakes on the property. We've seen them. I have never in my life noped like I noped at that moment. I pretty much teleported into the back of my Phil's pickup. 1 minute I standing in the way of hundreds of agitated snakes. The next I'm considering if I can fit through the little rear window of a Ford F-150. So, I've never had a really scary experience, but I did have an experience once where I went into panic mode and all I could think of was escaping the situation. I had this friend in college who really liked to drink. She had a big ass house to herself, so we drink together a lot. One night we were outside smoking and one of her neighbors comes up the driveway to his door and is chatting with my friend. Eventually he invites us over for drinks and gaming. He shares the house with another guy. They're both young military guys. We're there a while, have a few drinks, played Worms on the 360 and they got to show off their entertainment setup, which for the time was enviable. They were really cool guys. We're shooting the shit and one gets up and just says, "Be back in a second." He leaves for a minute or two and then comes back. He walks in the room and stands facing the other guy who also stands up. They are there just staring intensely at one another for a while and things are real awkward. My friend and I are wrapped. Then the one who had left reaches down, unzips his pants and whips out his cock. I'm going to preface this by saying, I have no problem with LGBTQ+. I don't care what any other consenting adults do in their free time, but I don't exactly want a front row seat. As the other guy proceeds to get into a kneeling position I am in a full-on panic. I'm grasping at my friend whisper talking, "Nat please, we have to leave." She stares slack-jawed, unmoving. I'm just about to start climbing over the couch to escape, when the guy kneeling firmly grasps the other dude's shaft, and then yanks the whole thing right out. Then proceeds to stick the most realistic rubber D you have ever seen to his forehead by a suction cup at its base, and the two of them laugh uncontrollably. I lost many a night to a booze-filled blackout with that friend of mine, but I will never forget that in 100 years. When I was 16/17, I was texting with a friend's older brother, 19/20, who was a local paramedic. He was sweet on me. Love bombing sweet. At that age, I didn't know better and just loved the idea that an older guy was so sweet on me. I'd only met him in person once at a ball game. One day, he randomly showed up to the little countryside cafe I worked at. He insisted I take his Letterman, even though it was in the heat of summer. It was weird but he was insistent so I took it. We kept texting and things got weird and possessive. I got scared and basically ghosted him. I never told him where I lived, but not even a few days later, I was home alone, way out in the middle of nowhere, with my younger stepsister, and I hear banging on the door. It was him. He was yelling for me to come out right away, beating the door. It was an old, run-down single-wide trailer, so nothing was really home invader proofed. He started kicking the door hard. The whole trailer was shaking, throwing stuff at the windows and screaming. I got my mom's shotgun, hid my stepsister in the closet, and called the police. It felt like forever. He didn't stop until I heard tires on the gravel pull up. A cop came inside and said he claimed I stole his Letterman and class ring, and was just there to get his stuff back. The ring was in the jacket pocket but I didn't know. I gave it to the cop, and I don't know what happened to him but needless to say there was not future contact. I still don't know how he learned where I lived.